Memphis, 1972. A packed press conference at the Peabody Hotel. Elvis sits at a long table surrounded by microphones and cameras. Reporter after reporter asks the usual questions: upcoming tour, new albums, his marriage. Then a young woman in the back, no more than 23, stands up. Her hand trembles slightly as she holds her notepad. She asks something that makes every seasoned journalist in the room freeze. The question isn't about music. It's about race, specifically about a quote attributed to Elvis years earlier that he'd allegedly never publicly addressed. The room goes silent. Elvis's smile fades. Colonel Parker shifts uncomfortably in his corner seat. What happens next isn't what anyone expected. The silence started before the question was even finished. It spread across the Peabody Hotel conference room like a slow stain, swallowing the low hum of conversation, the shuffle of notepads, the clicking of camera shutters. One by one, people stopped moving, stopped breathing, it seemed. All eyes turned to the young woman standing in the back row, her hand still raised, her notepad trembling just enough to catch the light. She was young, too young, some of the older journalists would later say, to know what kind of fire she was playing with. Her voice had been steady when she started speaking, but by the end of her question, there was a quaver in it. Not from fear exactly, from something else. Anticipation maybe, or the weight of knowing she'd just stepped across a line nobody else in that room had dared approach. Elvis Presley sat at the long table at the front of the room, bathed in the white glare of television lights, surrounded by a fortress of microphones. He'd been smiling just seconds before, one of those easy, practiced smiles he'd perfected over 15 years of fame. The kind that made people feel like they knew him, like he was their friend, their neighbor, their son. But the smile was gone now. His lips pressed into a thin line, his jaw tightened. His hands, which had been resting casually on the table, curled into fists. Not aggressive fists, defensive ones. The question hung in the air, unanswered, growing heavier with every passing second. Reporters in the front rows exchanged glances. A few shifted in their seats, someone coughed. In the far corner of the room, Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's manager, his handler, his keeper, leaned forward in his chair. His face was red, not the jovial red of a man enjoying a cigar and a good time. The red of a man whose carefully constructed world was cracking. He made a small gesture with his hand, a subtle cutting motion across his throat. The press coordinator saw it. She started to stand, ready to intervene, to move things along, to protect the product. But before she could say a word, Elvis raised one hand, just slightly, just enough. She froze, everyone froze. Because Elvis Presley, the man who'd spent his entire career being told what to say, when to say it, and how to smile while saying it, had just told the colonel no. Without saying a word, he told him no. The young reporter was still standing. Her name was Caroline Mitchell, though most people in the room didn't know that yet. She was a stringer for a black newspaper out of Atlanta, not one of the big names from the Memphis Commercial Appeal or the Associated Press. She hadn't been called on. She just stood up and asked. And what she'd asked was this: Mr. Presley, in 1957 you were quoted in a magazine saying that black people could only shine your shoes and buy your records. You've never publicly addressed that quote. So I'm asking now, did you say it? And if you didn't, why have you let people believe you did for 15 years? The room felt smaller suddenly, hotter. The walls seemed to close in. Veteran reporters who'd covered wars and scandals and assassinations felt their palms sweat. This wasn't supposed to happen. Press conferences with Elvis were choreographed affairs, soft questions about movies, music, upcoming tour. Nobody asked about race. Nobody asked about the ugly rumors that had followed him since the beginning. Nobody put him on the spot like this, not in public, not on camera, but she had. And now the room waited. Elvis stared at her, not with anger. Not with the indignation you'd expect from a man falsely accused. He stared at her with something that looked almost like recognition, like he'd been waiting for this moment, dreading it maybe, but waiting for it all the same. His band members sat along the side wall, session musicians, backup singers, some of whom had been with him for months, some for years. One of them, a black bassist named Roger Hayes, looked down at his hands. He didn't look at Elvis, didn't look at the reporter. Just at his hands resting on his knees, still and tense. Elvis saw that. You could tell he saw it because his expression changed. Something flickered behind his eyes. Hurt maybe, or shame. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The seconds stretched, 10 seconds, 15, an eternity in front of rolling cameras and waiting microphones. Colonel Parker stood up. He didn't storm out, but his chair scraped loudly against the floor, a clear signal of his displeasure, a warning. Elvis didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on Caroline Mitchell. And then he leaned forward close to the microphone and said three words that made two reporters in the front row gasp audibly, that made the press coordinator drop her clipboard, that made Roger Hayes finally look up. I was scared. Not I didn't say it. Not that's a lie. Not how dare you. Just those three words. Quiet, honest, terrifying in their simplicity. The room erupted in murmurs, in whispered questions, in the frantic scribbling of pens on paper. But Caroline didn't sit down. She stood there waiting because she knew, somehow she knew, that he wasn't finished, that those three words were just the beginning. Elvis took a breath, a deep, shaky breath, and then he started talking. But he didn't talk about the quote, not yet. He talked about Tupelo, about a shotgun shack on the wrong side of the tracks. About neighbors who were black, who were poor, who were kind to a skinny white kid with too much energy and not enough food. He talked about church, not his church, theirs, the Pentecostal services where he'd sneak in and sit in the back, mesmerized by the music, by the passion, by something he couldn't name but could feel in his bones. His voice was soft. The room had to strain to hear him. Camera operators leaned in. Reporters in the back stood up, because this wasn't the Elvis they knew. This wasn't the hip-swiveling, smooth-talking, all-American boy who sold records and movies and dreams. This was someone else, someone raw, someone breaking. He talked about the first time he heard Big Mama Thornton sing Hound Dog, how he'd listened to that record until the grooves wore thin, how when he recorded it years later, people called it his song, his, like he'd created it, like it hadn't come from a black woman who'd never see a fraction of the money or fame he'd get from it. His hands were shaking now, just slightly, but visible. The cameras caught it, the room felt it, and still he kept talking. He mentioned Arthur Crudup, the bluesman who wrote That's All Right, the song that launched Elvis's career. He said Arthur's name twice, slowly, like a prayer, like an apology. He talked about Sister Rosetta Tharpe, about Fats Domino, about all the people who built the road he walked on, people who couldn't walk it themselves, not because they weren't talented. Because they were black, the reporters weren't writing anymore, they were just listening. Some of them had tears in their eyes. Caroline Mitchell had tears streaming down her face, but she didn't sit down, she didn't move, because she knew what the others were starting to understand. This wasn't a deflection, this wasn't a PR move, this was a confession, but a confession of what? Elvis paused. He looked down at the table, at his hands, at the microphones, and then he looked back up at Caroline. You asked me about that quote, he said quietly. You asked me if I said it, and you asked me why I never denied it. He swallowed hard. I'll answer both, but first you need to know something. The room held its breath. I've been carrying something for a long time, Elvis said, and it's got nothing to do with what I did or didn't say in some interview 15 years ago. He paused. It's got to do with what I didn't say, what I didn't do, when it mattered. And then he said something that made even Colonel Parker, red-faced, furious, ready to pull him off stage, close his eyes and shake his head. I stayed silent, Elvis said, because part of me thought I deserved it. The words landed like stones in still water, sending ripples through the room that would spread for days, weeks, years to come. I stayed silent because part of me thought I deserved it. The confession hung there, raw and unfinished, begging for explanation. But Elvis didn't give one, not right away. He sat back in his chair, and for a moment he looked like he might stop talking altogether, like he might retreat back into the carefully constructed persona that had protected him for so long. Colonel Parker was standing now, his bulky frame casting a shadow across the side of the room. He made another gesture, more urgent this time, slicing his hand through the air like he was cutting a rope. End this now. But Joe Esposito, Elvis's road manager and closest friend, put a hand on the colonel's arm. It was a small gesture, easily missed in the chaos of the moment, but significant. Joe was loyal to the Bean for years, but he was more loyal to Elvis. And something in his face said he knew this needed to happen. The colonel shook him off but didn't move forward. He just stood there, seething, watching his golden goose crack open in front of the world. Elvis rubbed his face with both hands. When he lowered them, his eyes were red-rimmed, not from crying, not quite, but from something close. Exhaustion maybe, or relief. The relief that comes from finally setting down something you've been carrying too long. Let me take you back, Elvis said, his voice steadier now, like he'd made a decision and was committed to seeing it through. 1956, I'm 21 years old. I've got 3 #1 records, I'm on television, I'm in magazines. People are screaming my name. He paused, shook his head. And people are angry, real angry, not at the music, at what the music meant. The reporters were writing again, pens scratching furiously across paper, but their eyes never left him. Because this wasn't the sanitized version of history they'd been fed, this was something else. White folks said I was corrupting their children, Elvis continued. Preachers said I was the devil, parents said I was dangerous, and you know what the problem was? It wasn't the dancing, it wasn't the hair, it was that I was a white boy singing black music, making it acceptable, making it safe. His voice dropped, making it profitable. Caroline Mitchell was still standing in the back, her notepad forgotten in her hand. She wasn't writing, she was witnessing. There's a difference. I got letters, Elvis said, hundreds of them, some from white people calling me a race traitor, some from black people calling me a thief, and I didn't know what to say to any of them because they were all right and all wrong at the same time. He looked at Roger Hayes, the bassist sitting against the wall. Roger met his eyes this time, held them. I loved the music, Elvis said, speaking directly to Roger now, like they were the only two people in the room. I loved it before I understood what it meant, before I understood what it cost the people who created it. I was just a kid in Tupelo listening to the radio, feeling something I couldn't name, feeling like I belonged to something bigger than myself. Roger's expression didn't change, but he nodded, just once, just barely. Elvis took it like absolution, though whether he deserved it was another question entirely. So I sang, Elvis continued, turning back to the room. I sang and I became famous and I made money, more money than I ever dreamed of, more money than most of the people who taught me how to sing would ever see in their lifetimes. His jaw clenched, and that's when the guilt started. The air in the room felt thick, oppressive. Like the weight of what Elvis was saying was physically pressing down on everyone present. 1957, Elvis said, and Caroline flinched at the year of the interview, the year of the quote. I'm doing press for a movie, some Southern magazine. I can't even remember the name of it now. The writer is this older white man, real smooth, real friendly, asks me about my influences, so I tell him. I tell him about the gospel singers in Tupelo, about the blues musicians I listened to on Beale Street, about how everything I know about music I learned from black artists. He stopped, swallowed hard. I told him they were geniuses. I told him they should be famous. I told him they built the foundation of everything I was standing on. The room was silent again, but it was a different kind of silence now, not tense, waiting. The article comes out 2 months later, Elvis said. And it says I called black people Shushin boys, says I claimed they could only buy my records, not make music themselves, says I bragged about taking their sound and making it better. His voice cracked on the last word. It was the exact opposite of what I said, word for word, backward and inside out. He took what I said and twisted it into something ugly, something hateful, something that would hurt the very people I was trying to honor. A reporter in the third row raised his hand. Why? He asked, why would he do that? Elvis looked at him like he was a child asking why the sky was blue. Because he was angry, Elvis said simply. Angry about integration, angry about rock and roll, angry that white kids were listening to black music and loving it. He wanted to make me the enemy, wanted to make it seem like even I, the white boy who benefited most from it, looked down on black folks. He wanted to poison the well. Caroline's voice cut through the room, sharp and clear. You could have denied it. Elvis turned to her. I did, he said. Privately, I told my people it was a lie. I told RCA, I told the colonel. His eyes flicked to Parker. They said to leave it alone, said responding would only give it more attention, said it would blow over. Did it? Caroline asked. No, Elvis said quietly. It didn't. It spread. Underground newspapers picked it up. Civil rights groups talked about it. And I stayed silent, because the colonel said to, because I was 22 and didn't know any better, because I was scared. There it was again, that word, scared. Scared of what? Caroline pressed. Elvis looked at her for a long time. Scared of being called a liar, he said. Scared of making it worse. Scared that if I defended myself too loudly, I'd make it about me instead of about the real problem. He paused. Scared that even if I told the truth, people wouldn't believe me. Or worse, that they'd believe me and it wouldn't matter. The weight of it settled over the room like ash. And somewhere in all that fear, Elvis said, his voice barely above a whisper, I started to think maybe I deserved it. Not because the quote was true, but because even though it wasn't true, I was still guilty of something. I was still the white guy getting rich off black music, while the people who created it stayed poor. I was still the face of something I didn't create. I was still standing on their shoulders and getting credit for the view. Roger Hayes spoke for the first time. His voice was deep and steady. You think staying silent helped us? It wasn't accusatory. It was a genuine question. Elvis turned to him. No, he said, I don't. I think it helped me feel better about my guilt. I think it let me pretend I was being humble when really I was just being a coward. The room erupted. Not in shouts, but in a sudden burst of activity, reporters scrambling to adjust their notepads, photographers jostling for better angles, the press coordinator speaking frantically into a walkie-talkie. But beneath the chaos was something else. Something quieter and more powerful. Understanding. Not agreement necessarily, not forgiveness, but understanding, because what Elvis was describing wasn't unique to him. It was the machinery of America itself, the way it took and took and took from black people and gave the credit, the money, the glory to white people, and then acted surprised when someone pointed it out. Elvis wasn't special for benefiting from it. He was special for saying it out loud, but saying it out loud didn't fix it, and everyone in that room knew it. Caroline sat down slowly. She looked exhausted, like she'd run a marathon. Like she'd opened a door expecting to find one thing and discovered something much larger and more complicated on the other side. But she wasn't done, not yet. "Mr. Presley," she said, her voice cutting through the noise. The room quieted again. "You said the quote was a lie. You said you tried to deny it privately, but you never denied it publicly, not once in 15 years. Why now? Why today?" Elvis looked at her, really looked at her. And for the first time since the question was asked, he smiled. It was a sad smile, a tired smile, but genuine. "Because you asked," he said simply, "because you stood up and asked, and because I'm tired of carrying it." He leaned forward, elbows on the table, hands clasped. "But there's something you need to know, miss." He paused, realizing he didn't know her name. "Mitchell," she said. "Caroline Mitchell." "Miss Mitchell," Elvis repeated. "There's something you need to know. I didn't just stay silent because I was scared or guilty. I stayed silent because someone told me to, someone who had a vested interest in keeping me quiet, someone who thought the truth was less valuable than the image." Every eye in the room turned to Colonel Parker, but Elvis shook his head. "Not him," Elvis said. "Someone else, someone who knew exactly what that writer was going to do with my words before the article even came out." The room went still, dead still. "What are you saying?" Caroline asked. Elvis took a deep breath. "I'm saying I was set up," he said, "and I'm saying the person who set me up is in this room right now." Accusation detonated in the center of the room like a grenade. Heads whipped around, eyes darted from face to face. Reporters looked at each other with suspicion. Photographers lowered their cameras. The press coordinator went pale. Someone was set up. Someone in this room knew. Someone in this room had been carrying this secret for 15 years, watching Elvis twist in the wind, saying nothing. Colonel Parker's face had gone from red to purple. He took a step forward, his voice booming across the room. "Elvis, that's enough. This press conference is over." But Elvis didn't move, didn't even acknowledge him. His eyes were scanning the room now, moving across faces with an intensity that made people shift in their seats. He was looking for something, or someone. Joe Esposito moved closer to the table, positioning himself between Elvis and the Colonel. It was a subtle move, but everyone noticed. The Colonel noticed. His expression darkened further, but he didn't push past Joe. Not yet. "Mr. Presley," Caroline said, her voice shaking now, not with fear but with the electric charge of a story getting bigger by the second. "Are you saying someone in this room conspired with that magazine writer to misquote you, to deliberately damage your reputation?" Elvis finally looked away from the crowd and back at her. "Not my reputation," he said quietly. "Their reputation. The reputation of every black artist I named in that interview. Every musician I said was better than me. Every singer I said I learned from. Someone wanted to make sure that story never got told the right way." A chill ran through the room, because if that was true, if someone had deliberately twisted Elvis's words to make him sound racist instead of respectful, then this wasn't just about Elvis. This was about erasure, about making sure the narrative stayed clean and white and profitable. This was about keeping the true architects of rock and roll in the shadows where they'd always been. Who? The question came from an older reporter in the front row, a man who'd been covering Elvis since the beginning. His face was ashen. "Who would do that?" Elvis opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, a voice from the back of the room cut through the tension. "He doesn't know." Everyone turned. The voice belonged to a man in his 50s, standing near the door. He wore a pressed suit and thick-rimmed glasses. He had the look of someone official, record label, maybe, or management. Someone who belonged there but blended into the background. "Until now, he doesn't know," the man repeated, stepping forward, "because he never asked. He just assumed. He's been carrying this conspiracy theory in his head for 15 years, turning it over and over, making himself the victim of some grand plot, but he doesn't have a shred of proof." The room erupted in questions, but the man raised his hand. "My name is Martin Kessler. I'm a publicist with RCA Records." I've been with Elvis's team since 1959, and I'm telling you right now, this is a fantasy, a deflection. The quote was controversial. We advised him not to address it because we didn't want to fan the flames. That's all. There's no conspiracy. There's no setup. There's just a young man who said something stupid and doesn't want to take responsibility for it. Elvis stared at him. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then quietly, almost conversationally, he said, "You're lying." Kessler's expression didn't change. "Am I?" "Yeah," Elvis said. "You are, because I never said anything stupid. I said something true and you know it. You were there." The room went silent again. Kessler's jaw tightened. "I was not there." "Not at the interview," Elvis said. "But you were at the hotel the night before. You were having drinks with Harold Mitchum, the writer. I saw you." Kessler's face remained impassive, but something flickered in his eyes just for a second. But Caroline saw it. So did several others. "You're mistaken," Kessler said. "I didn't know Harold Mitchum." "That's interesting," Elvis said, leaning back in his chair, "because I never told you his name." The room exploded. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed. Kessler stood frozen, his face now carefully blank, but the damage was done. He'd slipped. He'd revealed knowledge he shouldn't have had, and everyone had seen it. Joe Esposito stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Martin, I think you should leave." Kessler looked at him, then at Elvis, then at the sea of reporters now staring at him like wolves who just caught the scent of blood. Without a word, he turned and walked toward the door. But Caroline was faster. She moved through the crowd with surprising speed, positioning herself between Kessler and the exit. "Why?" she asked. "If you did this, why? What did you gain from making Elvis look racist?" Kessler stared at her. For a moment, it looked like he might push past her, might walk out and never answer. But then something in him shifted. Maybe it was the weight of 15 years. Maybe it was the knowledge that the truth was coming out anyway. Maybe he was just tired. "You want to know why?" he said, his voice low and bitter. "Because he was going to ruin everything." Caroline didn't move. "Explain." Kessler laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You think RCA wanted Elvis telling the world that black artists were better than him? You think his movie producers wanted him naming names, telling kids to go buy Big Mama Thornton records instead of his? You think the South, the white South that bought his records and made him a star, wanted to hear him say he learned everything from black folks in Tupelo?" He shook his head. Elvis was worth millions, but only if he stayed in his lane. Only if he stayed the safe white boy who made black music acceptable. The second he started giving credit where it was due, the second he started telling the truth, he became a problem. The room was utterly silent now. Every word Kessler spoke was being recorded, written down, witnessed. This was the confession Elvis couldn't give, the one that came from inside the machine. "So we fixed it," Kessler continued. "Harold was an old friend, shared our concerns about where the culture was heading, integration, race mixing, the end of order. I showed him the interview transcript before it ran, told him what to do with it, told him how to flip it, make Elvis the villain instead of the saint, discredit him with the very people he was trying to uplift." He smiled, but there was no joy in it. And it worked. Civil rights groups wouldn't touch him after that. Black newspapers wrote him off. And Elvis, poor, guilty, stupid Elvis, never fought back, never questioned it, just took it like the punishment he thought he deserved. Caroline's hand was trembling as she wrote, "You destroyed his reputation to protect your investment." "I protected the natural order," Kessler said. "I protected America from tearing itself apart over a guitar player, and I'd do it again." The words hung in the air like a death sentence, not his death sentence, the death sentence of an entire era, because what Kessler had just admitted wasn't unique. It wasn't isolated. It was the quiet, unspoken policy of an entire industry. Keep the money white, keep the credit white, keep the power white, and if someone tries to change that, even someone white, destroy them. Elvis stood up slowly. His chair scraped against the floor. He walked around the table, past Joe, past the Colonel, who for once had nothing to say. He walked right up to Kessler and stood there, inches away, looking him in the eye. "You took 15 years from me," Elvis said quietly. 15 years I could have spent telling the truth. 15 years I could have used to lift up the people who deserved it. You stole that from me, and you stole it from them." Kessler met his gaze without flinching. "I did my job." "Your job," Elvis repeated. He laughed, a broken sound. "Yeah, I guess you did." He turned away, walked back to the table and sat down. He looked at Caroline. "You asked me why I never denied it publicly. Now you know. I didn't deny it because I didn't know how deep the lie went. I didn't know who I could trust. And by the time I started to figure it out, I was so deep in my own guilt that I didn't know if denying it would make things better or worse." He ran a hand through his hair. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I'm not asking for sympathy. I'm just telling you what happened. And I'm telling you that the system that did this to me, it's the same system that's been doing it to black artists since the beginning, taking their work, erasing their names, and making people like me rich. Roger Hayes stood up from his seat against the wall. He walked slowly to the center of the room. Everyone watched. He stopped in front of Elvis and looked down at him. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Roger said, "You should have fought harder." Elvis nodded. "I know. You should have fought louder. I know. But you're fighting now," Roger said, "so I guess that's something." He held out his hand. Elvis stared at it. Then slowly he stood and took it. They shook. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't absolution. But it was acknowledgement. And in that room, in that moment, it was enough. The reporters erupted in questions again, but Elvis raised his hand. "I've got one more thing to say," he said. The room quieted. "Martin Kessler is fired, effective immediately, and I'm done with RCA's publicity department. From now on, I speak for myself. I tell my own story. If that costs me money, if that costs me fans, if that costs me my career, so be it." He looked directly into the nearest camera. "To every black artist I named in that interview 15 years ago, and to the hundreds more I didn't name, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I didn't fight harder. I'm sorry I let them twist my words. I'm sorry I let fear and guilt keep me quiet. You deserved better. You deserve better now." He sat back down. "That's all I've got to say." But it wasn't. Because Caroline Mitchell, still standing near the door, asked one final question. "Mr. Presley, what did Harold Mitchum and Martin Kessler talk about that night at the hotel? What exactly did you see?" Elvis looked at her, and something dark passed across his face. "I didn't just see them talking," he said quietly. "I saw them laughing." The image settled over the room like a shroud. Two men in a hotel bar, drinks in hand, laughing as they plotted to destroy a young man's attempt at honesty. Laughing as they engineered a lie that would follow him for 15 years. Laughing as they helped bury the truth about the real creators of rock and roll under another layer of erasure and theft. Elvis's voice was hollow when he continued. "I was 21. I'd just done the interview that afternoon. Felt good about it, you know. Felt like maybe I'd finally said something that mattered. Something true. I came down to the hotel bar around 11, couldn't sleep, wanted a Coke. And I saw them. Martin and this other guy I didn't know, Harold. His eyes were somewhere else now, back in that Memphis hotel in 1957, watching something he didn't yet understand. They were in a corner booth, papers spread out on the table. I started to walk over, thought maybe Martin was working on something for my tour. But then I heard Harold say something. He said, 'The colored musicians, right?' He actually said they were better than him, and Martin laughed. He said, word for word, 'Kid's got a death wish.' The room was so quiet you could hear the air conditioning hum. I stopped," Elvis said, "stood there behind a pillar like a fool just listening, and Harold said, 'So we flip it, make him the bigot instead of the crusader. The South will eat it up. The integrationists will drop him. Problem solved.'" Martin raised his glass, said, "To protecting the brand." Elvis's hands were fists again. They clinked glasses, they drank, they laughed, and I stood there and did nothing, said nothing, just went back to my room and told myself I'd heard wrong, that I was paranoid, that Martin worked for me, worked for the label, he wouldn't do something like that. His voice cracked. But he did, and I let him, because when the article came out and I saw what they'd done, I still didn't say anything. I went to the Colonel, told him what I'd heard, and you know what he said? Elvis looked at Parker. The Colonel's face was unreadable now, carved from stone. He said, "You got no proof. You make this public. You look crazy. You look like you're throwing your own people under the bus to save face. Let it die, son. Just let it die." Elvis shook his head. "So I did. I let it die. And it killed something in me instead." Caroline's pen had stopped moving. She was just staring at him now, along with everyone else. This wasn't a press conference anymore. This was a confession, an exorcism. "For 15 years I've watched that lie spread," Elvis said. "Watched it show up in articles and books. Watched people cite it as proof that I was just another racist white boy stealing black music. And every time I saw it, I told myself the same thing the Colonel told me. You got no proof, you'll just make it worse. Let it die." He looked around the room. But it didn't die, it grew. And the more it grew, the more I felt like maybe it was true. Not the quote I knew that was a lie, but the spirit of it. Maybe I didn't say those words, but maybe I deserved to be seen as the person who would. Because I was still taking, still profiting, still standing in the spotlight while the people who taught me everything stood in the shadows. Roger Hayes spoke again, his voice quiet but firm. "That's not the same thing." Elvis looked at him. "Isn't it?" "No," Roger said. "One is something you said, the other is something the system does. You don't get to take credit for the racism of the whole damn system just so you can feel like you're carrying a noble burden. That's ego disguised as guilt. The words hit like a slap. Elvis blinked, rocked back slightly in his chair. You want to help? Roger continued. Then help. Pay the artists you learned from. Put their names on your album credits. Use your platform to tell people where the music came from, but don't sit here and act like letting people think you're a bigot is some kind of penance. That doesn't help anybody, that just makes you feel important. The silence that followed was different, sharper, more uncomfortable, because Roger was right and everyone knew it. Elvis had been carrying this lie, yes, but he'd also been using it as proof of his guilt, his awareness, his sensitivity. Using it as a shield against having to do the harder work of actually making things right. You're right, Elvis said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You're absolutely right. He looked at Caroline. I don't know if this is helping. I don't know if telling this story now makes anything better or if I'm just making it about me again. But you asked. You stood up and asked the question nobody else would ask. And I figured if I didn't answer now, honestly, I never would. Caroline nodded slowly. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady when she spoke. Mr. Presley, I need to tell you something. The room shifted. Everyone sensed a change in the air. I didn't come here with just a question, Caroline said. I came here with proof. I found the original interview transcript, the real one before Harold Mitchum changed it. It's been sitting in a university archive in Atlanta for 12 years. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody looked. Elvis sat up straighter. What? A professor I know does research on media and race, Caroline explained. She was going through old magazine archives and found a box of original interview tapes and transcripts that never got published. Rough drafts, first passes, and there it was, your interview, exactly like you said, you praising black musicians, naming names, giving credit, all of it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a folder. From across the room, even in the dim light, you could see the yellowed pages inside, photocopies, evidence. I've had this for 3 weeks, Caroline said. I could have published it. Could have cleared your name without ever talking to you, but I needed to know why you never fought back. I needed to hear it from you, because if you'd said it, if you'd actually said those racist words, then you deserved what you got. But if you didn't say it and you still didn't fight, she paused. Then something else was going on, something bigger. Elvis stared at the folder like it was a ghost. Can I see it? Caroline walked forward and handed it to him. The room watched as Elvis opened the folder with shaking hands. His eyes scanned the pages. You could see him reading his own words from 15 years ago, words he'd said and then watched get twisted into weapons. His lips moved silently as he read. Then he stopped. His finger rested on a particular passage. He read it aloud, his voice thick. I grew up listening to colored gospel singers in Tupelo. Those people had something I could never have, a depth of feeling, a pain and joy mixed together that came from living through things I couldn't imagine. When I sing, I'm trying to touch just a fraction of what they have. I'll never be as good as them, never. But if I can make people feel even a little bit of what I felt hearing them sing, then maybe I've done something worthwhile. He looked up. Tears were streaming down his face now, unchecked. He turned this into me calling them Shushin boys. He took this and made it into hatred. Caroline's voice was gentle. I know. Why didn't you just publish it? Elvis asked. Why come here? Why make me do this? Because it's not my story to tell, Caroline said. It's yours. And it's theirs, the artists you named, the ones who got erased. I could clear your name with a piece of paper, but that doesn't change the system. Doesn't change the fact that this keeps happening. I needed you to say it out loud, to admit what happened, to tell people that this isn't about one bad quote. It's about a machine designed to take black art and whitewash it. She held his gaze. I needed you to fight back, finally. Elvis set the folder down on the table. He looked at the cameras, at the reporters, at the microphone forest in front of him. He looked at Roger, at Joe, at the colonel, who for the first time looked old and uncertain. Then he looked back at Caroline. What do you want me to do? Tell them, she said. Tell them everything, not just about the lie, about the truth, about where the music came from, about who deserves to be remembered. Use this moment, use this attention, make it matter. Elvis nodded slowly. He turned back to the microphones. I want to read you something, he said. These are my words, my actual words from that interview in 1957, the words that got changed. The words I should have fought to protect. He picked up the transcript and began to read, not just the passage he'd read before, but all of it, every name he'd mentioned. Big Mama Thornton, Arthur Crudup, Sister Rosetta Tharpe, B.B. King, Fats Domino, Howlin' Wolf, Ivory Joe Hunter. He read his own words, praising them, honoring them, admitting his debt to them, and as he read, something happened in that room. The cynicism dropped away. The reporters stopped thinking about headlines and started listening to the story. The cameras kept rolling, But the operators stopped thinking about the shot and started thinking about the meaning, because this was history being corrected in real time. This was a lie being undone. Elvis finished reading. He set the pages down. "Those are the words I said 15 years ago," he said. "Those are the words that got turned into racism and hate. And I'm saying them again now, louder on the record, in front of all of you. Every black artist I named deserves to be remembered, deserves to be honored, deserves the success and recognition I got instead of them." He paused. "And I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure people know their names." The room erupted in applause. It started with one person, then spread. Not the polite golf clap of a press conference. Real applause. The kind that comes from witnessing something true. But Elvis didn't smile, didn't bask in it. He held up his hand until the room quieted again. "But here's what you need to understand," he said, his voice hard now, urgent. "This didn't happen because of one bad publicist or one racist writer. This happened because the entire system is designed to work this way, to take black art and make it white, to erase the origins and rewrite the history. What happened to me is nothing compared to what happened to them. I got my name cleared. They never even got their names in the history books." He pointed at the cameras. "So when you tell this story, don't make it about me. Don't make it about the poor white singer who got misquoted. Make it about them. Make it about the theft. Make it about the erasure. Make it about the fact that we are still doing it. Still taking, still erasing, still lying about where the music comes from." His voice rose. "Make it about the fact that Big Mama Thornton died broke while I got rich off her song. Make it about the fact that Arthur Crudup had to work manual labor while That's All Right made me a star. Make it about Sister Rosetta Tharpe playing guitar like nobody before or since and barely anybody knowing her name." He was standing now, leaning over the microphones. "You want a story? That's your story, not me, them." And then quietly, almost as an afterthought, he said something that would be quoted for decades. "I've been silent for 15 years. They've been silent for 100. Which silence matters more?" The room had no answer. Elvis sat down. He looked exhausted, hollowed out. But there was something else in his face too, something lighter, relief maybe, or the beginning of it. Caroline approached the table one more time. "Mr. Presley, I have one more question." Elvis looked up at her. "When I called your management to request this interview, someone tried very hard to keep me off the press list. They said you weren't taking questions about social issues. They said it wasn't relevant to your current tour. They tried to block me." She paused. "But I got in anyway. Someone overrode them. Someone made sure I was here today. Do you know who that was?" Elvis glanced at Joe Esposito. Joe stood against the wall, arms crossed, his face carefully neutral, but his eyes met Elvis's, and Elvis smiled. A real smile this time. "Yeah," Elvis said, "I know who it was." Joe Esposito didn't move, didn't acknowledge the eyes turning toward him. Just stood there against the wall, solid and still, like he'd been waiting 15 years for this moment, and now that it was here, he wasn't going to make a show of it. Elvis's smile faded, but the warmth in his eyes remained. "Joe called me 3 weeks ago," Elvis said, looking back at the reporters. "Told me a young journalist from Atlanta had been asking questions, digging into the old quote. Said she'd found something. Something that could change things." He paused. "Said I had a choice. I could keep hiding from it or I could face it head on. Let her ask the question in front of everyone. Let the truth come out, whatever that truth was." The colonel finally found his voice. It came out strangled, furious. "Joe, you had no authority. I had every authority." Joe cut him off, his voice calm but immovable. "My authority is Elvis, not you, not RCA, him, and he deserved to know the truth was out there. Deserved the chance to tell his side." He looked at Elvis. "Deserved the chance to stop carrying something that wasn't his to carry." Colonel Parker's face was apoplectic. "You've destroyed him, destroyed everything we built. This circus, this confession, do you have any idea what this does to his brand, what this does to his career?" "His brand," Roger Hayes said, the words dripping with contempt. He'd moved closer to the table now, standing shoulder to shoulder with Joe. "Man's been carrying a lie for 15 years and you're worried about his brand. Without the brand, there is no career," the colonel shot back. "Without the career, there's no platform, no money, no influence. I protected him. I kept him safe. I kept him successful." "You kept him silent," Caroline said. Every head turned to her. She stood in the center of the room now, the folder of documents still in her hand, her voice steady and clear. "You kept him profitable. There's a difference." The colonel's eyes narrowed. "You don't know what you're talking about, young lady. This business, this industry, it's more complicated than your idealism understands. Elvis would have been destroyed if we'd let him run his mouth about every social issue that came along. The South would have turned on him. The radio stations would have dropped him. The segregationists would have made his life hell. They made his life hell anyway, Caroline said. Just slower, quieter. They did it with lies instead of boycotts. They did it by turning his honesty into hatred. And you let them, because it was easier, because it kept the money coming. She took a step closer. Tell me, Colonel, when Elvis came to you in 1957 and told you what he'd heard, told you about Martin Kessler and Harold Mitchum plotting in that hotel bar, what exactly did you do? The Colonel's jaw worked. I protected my client. From what? From the truth? The silence was damning. The Colonel had no answer. Or rather, he had an answer but couldn't say it out loud. Because the truth was he'd protected the brand, not the man, protected the image, not the integrity, protected the profit, not the artist, and everyone in that room could see it written across his face. Elvis stood up again. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but firm. Colonel, you're fired. The words landed like a bomb. The Colonel's face went white, then red, then white again. You can't. I can, Elvis said. I just did. Effective immediately. We are done. Elvis, think about what you're doing. Think about, I've done nothing but think for 15 years, Elvis said. I'm done thinking, I'm doing. And what I'm doing is taking control of my own career, my own story, my own life. He looked at the cameras. From this moment on, I speak for myself. I make my own decisions. And if that means I lose half my audience, if that means radio stations drop me, if that means I never have another hit record, so be it. At least I'll be able to look at myself in the mirror. The Colonel stood frozen for a moment longer. Then, without another word, he turned and walked out of the room. The door closed behind him with a soft click that seemed to echo in the silence. Joe moved to Elvis's side. You okay? Elvis let out a long breath. I don't know. Ask me tomorrow. He turned back to the reporters. I know you all have questions. I know this is the story of the year, maybe the decade, but I need you to understand something. This isn't about me getting my reputation back. This isn't about me being the hero who stood up to the system. I'm not the hero of this story. He gestured to Caroline. She is. She did the work. She found the proof. She asked the question. And more importantly, he paused, making sure every camera was on him. The heroes of this story are the artists who created this music in the first place, the ones whose names should be in every history book, on every radio show, in every conversation about rock and roll. They're the ones who matter. They're the ones who deserve the recognition. A reporter in the second row raised his hand. What happens now? What are you going to do? Elvis looked at Roger. I'm going to start by doing what I should have done 15 years ago. I'm going to make sure every record I release from now on includes acknowledgement of my influences, liner notes naming the artists I learned from, and I'm going to start a foundation, funded by my own money, to support black musicians who never got their due, royalties for uncredited work, support for families of artists who died broke, recognition, real recognition. He looked back at the reporter. And I'm going to use whatever platform I have left to tell people the truth about where this music came from. Every interview, every concert, every chance I get, I'm going to say their names. Roger nodded slowly. It wasn't approval exactly. It was acknowledgement, a recognition that words were just words and the real test would be action. But it was a start. Caroline stepped forward one last time. Mr. Presley, there's something else you should know. Elvis looked at her. The transcript I found, it wasn't the only thing in that archive. There were letters too, letters from black musicians, letters they wrote to you over the years. She reached into her folder and pulled out copies of several letters. Her hands trembled slightly as she held them. Most of them never reached you. They were intercepted, filed away, hidden, but they said things I think you need to hear. Elvis's face went pale. What kind of things? Caroline looked down at the first letter. This one is from Arthur Crudup, written in 1961. It says, Dear Elvis, I heard you mention my name in an interview last month. Heard you say I wrote That's All Right. Nobody ever gives me credit for that, but you did. I want you to know that meant something to me, meant more than money, though I could use that too. Her voice caught. You're a good kid, Elvis. Don't let them change you. Keep saying our names. Keep telling people where the music comes from. That matters more than you know. The room was silent. Caroline looked up, tears streaming freely now. He died in 1974, died poor, died without ever knowing if you got this letter, died without ever knowing if you cared. Elvis's face crumbled. He put his hand over his mouth, his whole body shaking. Joe put a hand on his shoulder, steadying him. There are more, Caroline said quietly. Letters from Big Mama Thornton, from Willie Mee Thornton's sister. From musicians you named and ones you didn't. Some angry, some grateful, some just wanting to connect, to be seen, to matter. She set the letters on the table in front of Elvis. They never stopped believing you could do the right thing, even when you stayed silent, even when the lie spread. Some of them still believed. Elvis picked up the letters with shaking hands. He tried to read them, but his vision was too blurred with tears. He set them down and pressed his palms against his eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was wrecked. I didn't know, I swear I didn't know they'd written to me. I would have. He stopped, started again. I would have responded, I would have done something, I would have. I know, Caroline said gently. That's why I'm giving them to you now, because it's not too late. Some of these artists are still alive. Some of their families are still here. You can still reach out. You can still make it right. Elvis nodded, unable to speak. Press conference had dissolved into something else now, something more intimate and painful. The cameras were still rolling, but it felt almost intrusive, like watching someone's soul break open in real time. A young reporter in the back, barely out of college by the look of him, raised his hand tentatively. Mr. Presley, do you think this changes anything? Really? I mean, you're one person. The system is so much bigger than you. What can one person actually do? Elvis looked at him, wiped his eyes. Took a shaky breath. I don't know, he said honestly. Maybe nothing. Maybe I'm 15 years too late. Maybe the damage is done and can't be undone, but I have to try. I have to believe that telling the truth matters, that saying their names matters, that fighting back, even late, even imperfectly, matters. He looked at the letters on the table. Arthur Crudup said, keep saying our names. So that's what I'm going to do, for however long I have, however many people will listen. I'm going to say their names. The young reporter nodded and sat down. Caroline gathered her things slowly. She looked at Elvis one more time. Thank you, she said, for answering, for being honest, for fighting back. Elvis shook his head. I should be thanking you. You gave me something I didn't think I'd ever have. A chance to tell the truth, a chance to stop hiding. What will you do now? She asked. Elvis looked around the room, at the reporters who'd witnessed everything. The cameras that had captured it all. At Joe and Roger, standing like sentinels on either side of him. At the letters from ghosts and the proof of lies, and the weight of 15 years finally lifted. I'm going to go find Arthur Crudup's family, he said. Going to find Big Mama Thornton. Going to find every person I named in that interview and every person I should have named. And I'm going to tell them what I said here today. Going to ask them what they need, what would make a difference. And then I'm going to do it. He stood up. And then I'm going to make music, real music, honest music, the kind that honors where it came from instead of hiding it. The press conference was over. People began to gather their things, to file out, to rush to phones, to call their editors with the story of the decade. But Caroline lingered. She walked up to Elvis as he stood by the table, holding the stack of letters like they were made of glass. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, folded piece of paper. I didn't want to give you this in front of everyone, she said quietly, but you should have it. Elvis took the paper, unfolded it. His hands started shaking again. The paper contained 3 handwritten lines. They read, you were always one of us. You just forgot for a while. Come home. It was signed B.B. King, 1972. Elvis stared at the note. Read it again. He wrote this 2 weeks ago, Caroline said. When he heard I was going to ask you the question, he wanted you to know that if you told the truth, really told it, there was a place for you with them, with the people who made the music. Elvis folded the note carefully and put it in his pocket, right over his heart. Thank you, he whispered. Caroline nodded and turned to leave, but she stopped at the door and looked back. Mr. Presley, one more thing. Elvis looked up. The silence in this room when you answered my question, when you said I was scared, that silence was people listening, really listening. Maybe for the first time in your career, people heard you, not the image, not the brand, you, she smiled. That's what truth does. It cuts through everything else and makes people listen. Don't forget that. And then she was gone. The room emptied slowly. Joe and Roger stayed with Elvis as he stood at the table, staring at the letters, at the transcript, at the evidence of both the lie and the truth. Finally, Roger spoke. You meant what you said about the foundation, about using your platform? Elvis looked at him. Every word. Good, Roger said, because we'll be watching, all of us, watching to see if you follow through or if this was just another performance. Elvis nodded. I know, and I will, I promise you I will. Roger studied him for a long moment. Then he held out his hand again. Then I guess we'll see you around. Elvis shook his hand. Yeah, you will. Roger left. Joe started to gather Elvis's things, but Elvis stopped him. Joe looked up. Thank you, Elvis said, for letting her in, for making me face this, for believing I could. Joe smiled. You're welcome. Now let's get out of here before the colonel comes back with lawyers. They walked toward the door together. As they reached it, Elvis stopped and looked back at the empty conference room, at the table where he'd finally told the truth, at the space where 15 years of silence had ended. He thought about Arthur Crudup's letter, about B.B. King's note, about Caroline's question and Roger's challenge, and the cameras that had captured everything. He thought about the artists whose names he'd said and the ones he hadn't yet, the ones who'd died waiting for recognition. One still alive, still creating, still deserving, and he made a promise, not to the reporters or the cameras or the world, to himself, to them, he would say their names. Every day for the rest of his life he would say their names. He would make sure the silence ended, not just his silence, theirs. The door closed behind him. The room stood empty, but the echo of what had happened there would ripple outward for years to come. Some would say Elvis Presley found his voice that day in 1972. Others would say he'd always had his voice, he just finally found the courage to use it. But maybe the truth was simpler than that. Maybe he just stopped being afraid of the silence, stopped using it as protection, stopped hiding behind it. And in doing so, he'd broken it, not just for himself, for all of them. The silence was over, and what came after would be louder, messier, more complicated, and more honest than anything that came before. The young reporter had asked a question no one dared ask, and Elvis had finally answered, not with excuses, not with deflection, with truth. And the room, the whole room, had gone silent to hear it. That silence said more than any applause ever could. It said, "We are listening."